Today I'll be showing you how we can convert a generic shot like this one, which was shot around Lake Bled in Slovenia, into a dramatic black and white scene such as this one. So this particular transformation is very straightforward, but it requires specific localized masks. We will be using localized masks to increase and decrease exposure in certain areas in order to create drama and create more contrast. We will also be using a localized mask in order to brighten up our subject, which in this case is the couple walking with an umbrella, and we'll be making sure that our subject is the center of attention here. So let's go right ahead, and we can start with converting our photo immediately to black and white by just clicking the black and white option in the Basic tab in Lightroom Classic. Next, we'll be doing some basic adjustments in order to make sure that we have a balanced image before we proceed on to localized adjustments. So I'll be decreasing the highlights quite drastically right here, and I'll also be decreasing the blacks in order to create a bit more contrast in the shot. And this is already starting to look much better than it was, but we will need to do some localized adjustments in order to make it pop out and create some subject separation between the background and the subject itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create an effect where our eyes will immediately move towards our subject. And to do this, I'm going to first and foremost crop my image. I'm going to use the rule of thirds to put my subject somewhere around the first third right here in the bottom right corner. This should work well. I want to make sure that I'm not too close to the edge with this light pole right here, so I'm going to raise it just a little bit in order to leave some room right here. So next I'm going to use a radial gradient. This will be a large radial gradient in the middle. I'm going to make sure that my actual selection is particularly large, and then my feather can be very small right here. And since our main center of attention will be slightly shifted toward the right and the bottom, we can shift also this radial gradient towards the subject. I'm going to invert this mask, and then I'm going to start playing around with, first and foremost, the texture and clarity. I want to decrease them as much as possible in order to shift my attention towards the middle of the photo. Then I can increase the haze by just a bit in order to create more contrast in these particular areas. And I will also be reducing highlights completely, the blacks and the shadows as well. As you can see, we've created a sort of vignette, but we've moved it towards our subject. We can once again move this mask slightly towards the subject in order to create an effect which is better positioned for our eyes to move towards the subject. And then I'm going to create a radial gradient from this side, from the very left of the image, and I'm going to decrease the exposure as well as the blacks. Maybe this is a bit too much, so I can reduce the amount. And now I will move over to selecting my subject. So I will create yet another mask. I will click select subject, let Lightroom decide. However, I can see that the subject mask right here is not perfect. So I will immediately delete this mask, and I will click create new mask and select the object option. I will zoom in to my image to make sure that I can see my subject clearly, and I will make a rough selection around the areas that I want selected. You can see that my umbrella has been selected very well. I will click on Mask 2 and once again add objects to it, and I will roughly select the couple right here in my image, and Lightroom should now detect that I want only the selection of these two people instead of the weird selection that I had before. So as you can see, it's still not perfect completely, but we can easily subtract some parts of it using a brush tool. I will increase the flow and density of my brush tool, and as you can see, we're removing these parts quite easily now. Once the selection has been fixed and I can see that my mask is covering the subject entirely, I can start playing around with exposure in order to make my subject pop just slightly from the background. So right here I will increase shadows in order to bring out more detail in the shadow parts of the subject, but I will then compensate with darkening my blacks. So what this does is sort of increase the range of the shadows that I have in my image. I will also reduce the highlights because my umbrella right here is quite bright, and if I keep my highlights very bright, right here you can see that it pops out a bit too much. And what I want is to keep some balance between the umbrella and the couple below it. So I'm going to reduce the highlights of the umbrella and maybe increase the shadows a bit more, just slightly. And I will create a radial gradient which covers my subject. I will reduce the actual selection and keep the feather as large as possible. And now I will subtract my subjects from this particular selection, from this particular radial gradient. So similar to what I did with the subject selection, I'm going to remove this subject from this particular radial gradient. I will once again use the object selection tool to remove my umbrella as well. A rough selection should work well. And as you can see, we now have a mask for the background alone. And now I would like to increase exposure. As you can see, we're increasing exposure in the distance. It seems like we're increasing the exposure in the distance in front of our subject. And I will try to create some kind of light which feels like there's some separation between that background and the subject itself. So for this instance, I will also decrease the haze. I can decrease texture and clarity just slightly, maybe just texture, and I will compensate by reducing highlights completely. You can also decrease the blacks and maybe increase contrast as well. One final thing I would like to do to my shot before I finalize this edit is to color grade my shot based on the black and white color mix. One thing I know is that I have a lot of greens, some yellows, and maybe some magenta and purples in my shot. So I will start off with the yellows and the oranges, and I will reduce them just slightly in order to create even more contrast in the overall image. And if I lower my greens just slightly, this should give an even more balanced effect to the overall image. I'm going to move over to the tone curve, which is my final step practically, and I'm going to create a really small S-curve right here to create even more contrast. As I generally tend to say in my tutorials, contrast tends to create even more drama. So aiming for a lot of contrast in our image will give us the drama that we're looking for this particular edit. However, we can probably see that all our blacks are clipped if we decide to show our clipping for shadows. And what I would like to do for this is to increase my black point in the tone curve. So what we've done now is we've moved our black point towards a more grayish black. What I can see is that the overall image is still a bit too dark, so I will compensate by increasing the blacks that I had decreased in the beginning of the tutorial. We can also compensate by increasing slightly the greens that we decreased previously. So I feel like this is a much better look than what we started with. And if we compare the before and after of this shot, we can see that we've gone from quite a beautiful shot of this street with our subject walking, sort of walking in the distance, and these trees surrounding our subject. Obviously, it was a very generic shot, and we've managed to turn it into this sort of dark, dramatic shot. I would say that the main focus of this shot would be that the subject has been separated from the foreground by using that radial gradient in front of our subject and increasing the exposure there in order to feel like our subject is moving towards a lighter area. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope that you have shots such as this to practice this technique with. And as always, thank you for watching, and please make sure to like and subscribe.